We know there's many things that we could focus in on this morning as we think about the commandment, you shall not steal. And many reasons why we should not steal. There's love. You shouldn't steal because you love your neighbor. You want what's good for your neighbor. So you're not going to steal from your neighbor. You shouldn't steal because society and the harmony of society depends on people being trustworthy and honest. Probably lots of you here can think about a lovely time in the past when you didn't have to lock your door, when you didn't have to lock your bike up when you went to the shops. But now we're in an age in the West of insurance that keeps on climbing. You must lock your doors. There's alarms on everything. And it's a different type of world. All because over 50% of crime in Britain is robbery. But we're not going to focus on those aspects this morning when we come to think about the command, you shall not steal. I would like us just to focus in on a way of thinking that is both to motivate us not to steal and also a kind of formula almost. 3 truths that will really help us not to steal. And we're thinking mainly about physical stealing, property, which is what the command has mainly in mind. So the title of today's sermon is Owner, Distributor, Satisfied Steward. And I would say that those 3 truths can keep us from stealing. God is the owner of everything. The owner of everything. God is the distributor of everything. He gives what all people have. And if we are in Jesus Christ this morning, we should be satisfied stewards, caretakers, temporary owners of the things that God gives us. So let's think about this morning under the first heading, God is owner and distributor of everything. When I was about 4 or 5 years old, my mother said to my older brother, one of my older brothers, you must take Jamie with you. And that was great news for me. He was 5 years older than I was. It was bad news for him. So here I went out following my brother up the road with all his friends, and I was tagging along at the back because I wasn't really welcome. And they were all hanging out. We walked around the corner and we passed these shops that were nearby. And one of the shops was a grocer's shop. And it had quite a long front. And at the very front of the grocer's shop were all kinds of different food. And in one big basket were all these peanuts, unshelled peanuts. And I was a little bit behind. And I looked at my brother's friends. And I saw them as they walked along. They put their hand in the peanuts and carried on walking. And I came and I thought, wow. That's amazing. So I put both my hands in and picked up all these peanuts. And then suddenly someone said, Oi, what you doing? Put those down. And in one moment I discovered they had an owner. We all need this morning to discover afresh that everything in this world has an owner, God. Oi, it's mine. I own it. That's what Psalm 24 says. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Psalm 50 says every animal of the forest is mine. And the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird in the mountains and the insects in the fields are mine. God owns the earth and everything in it, and he gives it to whom he pleases. He distributes it as he sees fit, according to his wisdom and his sovereignty and his control. Paul said this to the people in Athens in Acts chapter 17. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands, as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. Do you see? He is the giver, the owner and giver. From one man he made all the nations that they should inhabit, live in the whole of the earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. Do you see that? God is the giver. He's the giver of your life. He's the decider of when you live. He's the decider of where you live. In what age? In what nation? For how long? God is the great allocator of everything. And we have that repeated picture throughout the Bible. We can think of a couple of examples. In the Old Testament, the nation of Israel went into the promised land, Canaan, and God decided their boundaries. And they had to accept those boundaries. Some were much bigger than others. God gave them. In the New Testament church, God gives spiritual gifts. And we receive. We accept that he's the distributor. Jesus Christ has risen up on high. And he gives gifts. And even when God gives these things to us, they still remain his. That's what he told the children of Israel back when they went into Canaan. In Leviticus 25, he says, the land must not be sold permanently. So he's portioned off the land, and he says it mustn't be sold permanently because the land is mine, and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. Throughout the land that you hold as a possession, there's their ownership, and yet God owns it. You must provide for the redemption of the land. In other words, that land must be able to return to its original owners. You cannot do with it as you wish. That was why they had the year of Jubilee. Every 50 years, no matter what had happened to the land, it went back to its original owner in the year of Jubilee, because God was the giver and owner of all things. The nation wasn't free to do with their possessions as they willed. So what does it mean for us that God is the owner and distributor of everything? Well, first, it means we don't resent what he gives others. We don't resent what he gives others. We are not to resent people owning things. The right to own property is a God-given right. And this command in Exodus chapter 20, you shall not steal, heavily implies that people have a right to own things and you're not to take it from them. It's a God-given right. It's part of being made in the image of God. God is the owner. He gives to humanity the right to rule and reign, and within that ruling and reigning is the right to own as he owns under him. You shall not steal, because God allocates things to people. And we have received according to his wisdom. Maybe someone is wealthy through legal means. You're not to resent that. Maybe someone is wealthy through illegal means. You're not to resent that either. God will judge them, either directly or through the law of the land. But they will be judged if they have gained wealth through illegal means. But either way, we are not free to take it from them. We are not Robin Hood. Robin Hood is not biblical. Do you know who Robin Hood is? We don't know whether he really existed. We say he existed in the late 1100s, early 1200s, and he's held up as a hero who stole from the rich to give to the poor. But that's not the right thing to do? Who decides who is rich and who is poor? To be Robin Hood is a dangerous thing because he justifies stealing. He makes stealing a relative thing. It depends on the circumstances whether you can steal or not. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. It all depends. So a teacher once asked her classroom, what would you do if you found a case and it had £500,000 inside the case? And quickly, one boy said, well, if it belonged to a poor family, I'd give it back. And if it belonged to a rich family, I would keep it. Now, of course, I don't know how you could really be that poor if it belonged to you, 500,000. But you see, he was thinking relatively. He thought it was okay. He could justify on some level stealing. And so he has made the command not to steal relative rather than absolute. Look at verse 15. It is very absolute. It focuses in on the action. You shall not steal. It's very all-encompassing. It doesn't leave anything out. Anything you can think of falls into that category. So there's a question. Are we modern-day Robin Hoods? Are we? Do we justify stealing according to a certain set of principles? Would you steal from your friend? You might say, never. Would you steal from Amazon? If they credited you in a wrong manner, would you go, hey, they deserve it. Look at them. They're a big business corporation treading on everyone. I'm justified in stealing. Or they won't miss it. Look at them. They're huge. They won't miss it. You've turned stealing into something relative. Something you can justify. You might say, if my friend dropped a £20 note on the floor, I would pick it up and I would give it to them. Of course I would. But what happens if you receive a double credit from your bank? What do you do then? Do you sit on it? I'll wait to see what happens. I won't spend it, but, I won't tell them about it. Maybe in 6 months. Maybe you get an extra month at the gym by some mistake. What do you do with that? Can you justify it? You shall not steal. There is nothing relative about the commandment. So don't resent those to whom God gives wealth, but we don't rearrange either what God gives others. We don't rearrange. We don't have it as part of our agenda to rearrange and think that we have a right to rearrange what God has given to others. We don't do this by kind of forcing equal distribution of wealth. That's not a biblical concept. The Bible recognizes there will always be rich and poor. The Bible says that possessions are not what make life and give it its substance, not ultimately. So when we force an equal distribution of wealth, we begin to take the place of God. We act like the owner and the distributor. We think that we know what is best and we know what's going on. Imagine with me a family of 16 children, if you can imagine that far. I don't know whether there's been some big families in this church in the past. I don't know whether they got to 16, but pretty close, I think. But imagine a family of 16 children, and the lunches have all been made the night before for school, and there they all are lined out, and one of the little children comes down and she notices that some have a whole lot more food in than the others, and some have a lot less in than the others. And she wants to go about changing them all to make them all equal. That seems fair. But what she doesn't realize is that one of the children is staying late that day. they're going to be right there into the evening. And another of the children, she actually goes to school with a friend who never has lunch. And so the mother is expecting her to share. The mother knows what she's doing. She knows why she's allocated the way she has allocated. But if the child isn't careful, she will step into the shoes of the parent without seeing the big picture. So you shall not steal commands us not to force equal distribution of wealth. This does not rule out charitable giving. This doesn't rule out being generous. That's voluntary. That's what you can do. You can choose to do that. In a way, that's the difference between charitable giving and something like communism, where you're forced to share. No, choosing to share. That's a different story. God is pleased with that kind of approach. In the illustration, the one child has more, and she's expecting to share it with the one that has nothing. So we don't force equal distribution, and we don't rearrange either by stealing. That's not what we do. Stealing is an attempt to rearrange what God has done. We're not to carry off. That word steal means to carry off. We're not to carry off illegally what belongs to somebody else. What are some of the ways that people steal today? Well, let's just think through. I'll try and go through a bit of a list if you can stay with me. But we've got the concept in the Bible of dishonest scales, haven't we? Have you come across that picture of dishonest scales where someone makes the weights either heavier or lighter so that they might, by misrepresenting the facts, gain more themselves or have to pay less? Dishonest scales, God hates them. But what about tax forms and when you fill out your benefits forms? How do you represent the truth? Do you try to make your income look smaller that you might get back more benefits? What about if you work as maybe a carpenter or as a plumber, or you do some sort of service like that, and you have to buy materials? Do you put in your quote an exaggerated price for the materials so that you receive more pay? Maybe you're a cleaner and you go to your house, but you never clean where they're not going to look. That's stealing as well. Or maybe at work, you're lazy and you skive. You don't give a full day's work. You know, they say on average that most workers work 80% of the day. That means in a 5-day week, 4 days a week. That's stealing, if that were you. Maybe you call in sick when you're not sick. That's stealing. Or when you just feel a little bit under the weather. Dishonest scales. There's grazing as well. We had a concept of grazing in the passage we read together, where the farmer casually let his cattle and cows wander into the other field of another person, where they ate up things that could never be got back. That was stealing. Maybe you live in a house with a shared fridge. Do you graze on other people's food? It's not yours, but you somehow think you're free to graze on it. Or maybe you're in a shared house and you haven't bought shower gel for I don't know how long because you just use other people's. You just graze on their stuff. Or you're in a shared classroom and you're always just taking other people's pens and rubbers and erasing away their... It's a small little thing, isn't it? But in the command, you shall not steal, it doesn't have a quantity by it. A penny or a pound or a million. See, God is searching for a people of integrity who really shine in a world that is full of corruption, where honesty is a beautiful robe that the church wears, and people marvel at why you behave the way you behave. Lazy people can often be thieves. They borrow something and they couldn't be bothered to give it back. That's stealing. They owe and they can't be bothered to pay. That's stealing. Or we can be tight-fisted. 1 Timothy 5 says, if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Not giving to your children when they are in need and you are able to give. Not giving to your parents when they are in need and you're able to give. Not helping out a relative in their need when you are able to give. That is stealing. The help they should receive from you, they don't receive. Do you see that? This can be true in the church also. The church is to do its best to meet genuine needs amongst us. And when we turn a blind eye to genuine needs, when there is the ability within the church to meet those needs, that's like stealing. Or you can think of the example of someone like a pickpocket. The Artful Dodger was a famous pickpocket, wasn't he, in the story of Oliver Twist? Opportunist, happy to take when he got the chance, sometimes in broad daylight or behind closed doors. But illegal downloads, illegal live streaming, where you just have to watch it. You have to. And you justify what you watch, what you take. Using iPlayer without a license. They're a big corporation. They don't deserve it. They're corrupt. Ignoring copyrights. Plagiarism, where you take something on the internet and then you present it as your work on your coursework. That's laziness as well. That's dishonest scales. So many areas where God calls us not to steal, where he calls us to shine brightly, where he calls us to love him so much and find our satisfaction in him, as we're going to see in a minute, that these things don't appeal in that way. So there's a question. Are you rearranging, redistributing in any of these ways at the moment? Are you stealing in that way? If you are, in a way, you're living like God is not owner and distributor of everything. You're not stopping to recognize his sovereign place and to honor how he is doing things, what he has given and what he has not given. If you want to keep from stealing, you must always keep at the forefront of our hearts and minds that God owns everything and he is the distributor of everything. But also we need to keep in mind that we are satisfied stewards. That will help us not only a fear of God as the owner and distributor, but a recognition that we are truly satisfied in him. We're satisfied temporary owners of what God has given. Jesus, he is the one who has said, I am the bread of life. That's what he says to you and me. I satisfy you. I am all that you need. I am living water to you. I provide all your needs. In me, you have everything you need. I, says Jesus, am that person to you. I know it might be hard to see sometimes through all the materialism that goes on, but do you believe that Jesus can satisfy you completely? That one person who is God, who is abundant and infinite in all his ways. Paul could say in Philippians chapter 4, I have learned to be content. I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. Let me see if I've got the slide for that. I do. There, thank you. I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. Can you see that Paul was a satisfied steward? That's what he was. He was satisfied. And he was satisfied and content with Christ. That's who made him satisfied in whatever situation. So Paul could say, for me to live is Christ. If I'm going to live, I live for Christ. He feeds me. He is all I need, ultimately. Yes, I rejoice in when I have plenty, but when I don't have, I have Christ. When we are contented and satisfied with Christ, we won't steal. Have you thought about that? We will evaluate every temptation that comes our way, whether it's on the internet or whether it's something that other people own, and we will look at it and we will say, if I have that, it cannot give me what Christ gives me. It cannot meet my needs like Christ can. I will not give to it. I will not exalt it to the point where I have to take it and steal it and go after it as if it can give to me what Christ alone can give to me. And when we have that attitude, we will be satisfied stewards. I wonder, is that what we are this morning? Satisfied stewards. But we're not only satisfied stewards because we have a great Savior, Jesus, but we're satisfied stewards also because we're satisfied with the inheritance that He gives us. It's not just that we have Christ, because to have Christ is to have everything. To be joint heirs with Christ, to be brought into the family of God, to have all that He has. That's the reality of every Christian in this room this morning. Paul could say like this in Romans chapter 8, He who did not spare His own Son. Do you see? In a way, Jesus is called His own Son there. There's ownership to a certain degree. There's recognition that the Father gives His precious Son. The owner is so generous. He distributes His Son to the church. And He gave Him up for us all. How will He not also with Him graciously give us all things? In Christ we are rich beyond all measure. We really don't need to steal anything from anyone. When we do, as Christians, when we steal, we behave like King David. Do you remember King David? He was king. He had everything. God had poured abundance into his life. He had many wives. And yet he saw the wife of Uriah the Hittite, who had one wife. And he took her and he murdered Uriah. And God sent a prophet to King David who told him the story of a poor man who had one little lamb who was a favorite in the family. One lamb, and a rich landowner who had a friend coming to visit. Instead of taking from his masses of flocks, he went and took and stole that man's one lamb and used it for the feast and the food. And David, when he heard this, he was outraged. He says, this is terrible. That person deserves death. And Nathan said, you are that man. But when we steal, dear brothers and sisters, when we steal, we are that person. It's like we're saying, God hasn't given us enough. Well, I don't have an abundance. I'm not a child of the King. I don't have a great inheritance. We lose sight of that. And we chase lesser things. Now, of course, in the story, the lamb was precious. And we don't even go after precious things. We go after trivial things, things that don't satisfy, and we steal. Your God has given you everything in Christ. Do you steal like he hasn't? So because we're satisfied stewards, because we know who owns and distributes everything, we are not graspers, but givers. That's what we are. That's what the Christian should be. And Paul says, he says this in Ephesians chapter 4, really. He says, anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer. So he's talking to those who have been bought by Jesus Christ. Anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work, doing something useful with their own hands. Why? That they may have something to share with those in need. Do you see the transformation from grasper to giver, from stealer to sharer? That's the transformation that God brings about in our lives. That's what happened to Zacchaeus. Do you remember him? What an example of transformation from grasper to giver, from thief to philanthropist, if I can get that word out. He was a tax collector who spent his life grasping, and then he encountered the generosity of God. Have you encountered the generosity of God in your life? Has it bundled over you and overwhelmed you in the person of Jesus Christ? Have you seen all that he is to you and has done for you? Zacchaeus encountered Jesus. He encountered a God who is abundant, and it transformed him. He said, right now I give away half that I have. And if I've wronged anybody, I will give 4 times back. Now, you and I might not be as wealthy as Zacchaeus, but our heart can be changed in the same way. We can possess the same attitude of generosity and openness, having been overwhelmed by the generosity of God that transforms us from a grasper into a giver. Jesus is enough for you and me. We might go through difficult times. And I know there are some people going through very difficult times here and in the world at large. Christians are being really tested that Jesus is enough. But that isn't only the testimony of the Bible, that is the testimony of Christians down through the ages. Those that have suffered and trusted in God, they have found that he is sufficient, that he is abundant. And this is sometimes hard for us to imagine because we have so much. So God is the owner of everything. God is the distributor of everything. And his people are to be satisfied stewards of all that he gives. We have no reason to steal. But we have every reason to give and be generous as we are able. And we have every reason to be content. And when we are, the world will see the beauty of the 10 Commandments lived out in our lives. You shall not steal will be like a beautiful robe that people see and marvel at and wonder what it is about you that gives you such honesty and integrity. And the answer is, I am satisfied in Jesus Christ. Amen.